get going. My name is Peter Evans. I'm a co-chair of the Platform Strategy Summit. And we also have Jeff Parker. This year, we're joined by Pinar Oscom, who from Oxford University, and she's going to share some of her latest research and insights. And then, of course, Marshall Van Alstyne as well. So we're going to spend the next, I guess it's the next 45 minutes presenting some key content based on an overview of what's been happening over the last year and a bit of an outlook. So why don't I start off with a look at what's been happening and kind of a perspective on the outlook. So what I'd like to do is look at platform trends that are emerging and have a little bit of a framework here of what we're seeing now, what we're beginning to see, and then what's on the horizon. And this can be useful, obviously, for corporate strategy planning purposes, for product launches. There's a whole variety of reasons why you might want to do this kind of outlook. And what I'm going to do in 10 minutes I have here to present is to share with you some insights across each of these dimensions. The first one is we're beginning to see industrial companies look for growth via platform strategies. And one great example of this is Shell, who has reached out and joined with IBM to create a new marketplace that they call Orin. This was launched last year. This is a marketplace that is designed to provide solutions in a whole range of analytics and other types of business engagements with the mining sector. And what's interesting is, Shell has already been engaged with the mining sector largely through its delivery of different kinds of oils and lubricants. And so they actually have lots of touch points with the mining industry, but they hadn't really engaged it fully. And so this platform is designed not just to sell Shell products, but to engage other third parties in a platform strategy in a marketplace for these kinds of solutions that can help the mining industry with a bunch of different activities, including operations, asset management, supply chain, and then they have a suite of areas of focus around sustainability as well. And so that's an interesting initiative and a way for a large company that's looking to transition away from fossil fuels and find new growth opportunities. In a completely different area, we see TikTok, which has exploded over the last few years and now has, well, just in the last year or so, had over 1.5 billion downloads and more than 500 million active users. So it's a massive platform. And what's interesting is that they're now moving into enterprise. So they're created a unit called TikTok for Business, in which they're engaging their creators and matching them with businesses for content around marketing, advertising, and things of that nature. And obviously, they have a lot of insight into the size and the focus of those particular influencers that can be matched with companies. Now, what's also interesting is that you're seeing integrations with companies like Shopify. So Shopify is a very large e-commerce platform. It has over 1 million merchants serving 175 countries. And they have recently announced an integration with TikTok. So that means that a merchant on the Shopify platform can now get access to TikTok creators. And as I just mentioned, there are over 500 million active users of TikTok. So within that pool, there's going to be some amazing creators that have large fan bases that a particular merchant on Shopify can now get access to. So you've suddenly just reduced the transaction costs of engaging them and a whole new way of doing marketing and advertising that could actually be quite disruptive. And it's on a continuous on-demand kind of cadence. And so this is a very interesting and just one example of these very large platform-to-platform integrations that are taking place. Another one that's interesting is Amazon. You know, obviously Amazon has created a dominant position in e-commerce, but it's moving beyond. You know, the e-commerce space is getting crowded. There are more and more companies launching e-commerce activities and platforms. But Amazon is now launching things like Amazon Live, as well as Amazon Explore. And these are new ways of creating experiences that have a e-commerce element to them. So Amazon Live is a video production where you could have a merchant or an influencer come on and pitch products and talk about them in an authentic way. And they'll have multiple of these channels running at the same time, focused on different products in different parts of the world. And then Amazon Explore are exploratory options. So for example, learning how to cook in a cooking class out of Italy, or visiting an orchid farm in Costa Rica. And so that's pretty interesting. And now Amazon is offering experiences to Amazon Prime members. So this is Amazon moving into experiences, which, interestingly enough, you've probably seen this very famous Amazon flywheel. If we look and dig into how these experiences are adding to that, it's actually adding a whole nother dimension to the network effects. So the sellers can now connect with influencers and hosts through the Amazon Live to enhance the experience, which, as I mentioned, opens up a whole new host of network effects. So pretty interesting vehicle there. Okay, now moving on, you may have heard of what they call NFTs. These are these non-fungible tokens, and they're different from Bitcoin, for example, is considered a fungible token, i.e. it can be used in exchange. It doesn't have scarcity value in that way, but non-fungible tokens create a direct linkage to a particular digital asset, and therefore create a chain of origin, and have been really influential over the last 6 months in terms of art, sports, music, and just since February this year, January, February, we've seen $2.5 billion worth of NFTs sold. So that's pretty interesting. Now the question is how is this market unfolding? And we're finding that many of these NFTs are sold through platforms. And one are kind of reminiscent of the eBay model, where they're very broad. They will sell NFTs across a wide range of domains like sports, music, and art. And they're really focused on offering a streamlined, low-cost approach and reach a very broad audience. On the other side, we're seeing services being offered on top of the platforms. And so these are deeper in terms of the range of services that they provide. And so we call these augmented. So you're seeing the market move in these two different directions. So we don't see the NFT marketplace moving to a winner-take-all kind of outlook, but rather a specialization on one end and big platforms on the other. A final observation, this is kind of on the horizon, is looking at this emergence of super apps. If you recall from last year, we had Connie Chen speak at the conference from Andreessen Horowitz, and she spoke about this move to have more and more services offered in one offering through an app. And so the app leader or provider doesn't have all of these services themselves, they're bundling them, right? And Grab is an interesting example. This is out of Southeast Asia. They started as a ride-hailing taxi similar to Uber, and they have subsequently added delivery of food, hotel accommodations, financial services. And so this is a great example and is often pointed to. But what's interesting is not they're the only one in Southeast Asia. You also have GoTo, which just emerged through a merger. And so it now has a valuation estimated around 40 billion, so quite large, similar to Grab. And then you have Sea, which is another one of these kind of super apps emerging. And so there's this nascent battle brewing in Southeast Asia. And I think a interesting question is will this spill over and become a broader one? Not necessarily with these particular platforms, but this super app model is getting a lot of attention, and we're likely to see efforts by others around the world to follow this path. And so we could see a battle of apps. So just to summarize here, what are we seeing now? Industrial companies taking adjacency plays using platform strategies, this whole rise of the creator economy through integrations with platforms, example of Shopify and TikTok. And then we have the experience economy and platforms, and Amazon is a great example of that. And we have others as well. And then blockchain innovations and the rise of NFTs are now growing through platform strategies. And then finally, the coming super app battles are another interesting thing, important thing to watch. So with that, let me turn it over to Jeff.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you so much. Happily, the mic seems to be going now. So I'll just say a word or two thanking David and Devin. This is now our 9th running of the MIT Platform Strategy Summit. And I have to say, it's been an amazing evolution. I didn't think that we were going to go from a small room in the MIT Media Lab to basically filling the entire facility to then moving online. So one hopes that next year we'll be back in person at MIT, but I think this online format has allowed for a much wider participation, and I think that's an innovation that's worth hanging on to. So we'll be thinking about how to run a really great hybrid event next year, but this year, as Devin laid out, we've got fireside chats, we've got panels, we have music, and we have networking. So really, really happy to be one of your co-chairs this year. And let's take it away to the next slide. Peter. All right, so where I want to go with our content is I want to share a couple of things that I've been working on with some of our research partners. And in particular, what we've been looking at over the past year, actually a couple of years, is a deeper dive into business-to-business platforms. And in particular, we're trying to understand what some of the differences are between what we learned from business to consumer and what we're reasonably sure is different in the business to business world. When we wrote our book, Platform Revolution, really got going with that in 2013 and then published in 2016. I say the biggest firms were the consumer facing firms. So many of the examples that you'll have seen were your Airbnbs and Ubers and Apple and Google and eBay and the like. And then, of course, the computer operating systems. What's been interesting, and I think we predicted it, but it's starting to come to fruition, is the rise on the B2B space. And I think that's only natural that you'd have firms that had large established operations. So think your Siemens, for example, your Fords, your aircraft companies, that were able to effectively continue in their business operations, but clearly they were paying attention to what's been happening in the economy. And now we're seeing a whole set of business to business applications, platforms, IoT systems, and the like emerge and start to grow fairly fast. So next slide. So what's interesting that we wanted to dig into, and each of these bullets honestly would merit several minutes. So I'm just going to kind of march through. We recognize great differences on the customer needs side and sales cycle. The pricing and cost sensitivities are clearly different in B2B markets. The marketing approach itself is different. I think the product knowledge is a particularly interesting one because that gets into the degree that you have to integrate systems, often with legacy systems. And so unlike a customer or consumer just opening up an app or a web page and everything being reasonably intuitive, often on the integration side for manufacturing, supply chain, marketing systems, anything B2B, there's just a lot more complexity there. In addition, issues of trust, and then I'd say we'll zero in on data ownership. And I know Marshall will cover more of that, so I don't want to go too far into that. But there's a real contest over who owns data. And as an individual dealing with some of the giant social media or commerce platform firms, you don't have much negotiating leverage. But on the other hand, if you're a large firm and an asset owner, then you're on a different playing field when you're negotiating over both who has rights to the data, but also the rights to what that data can produce. And then a final area that I think is interesting is this notion of interaction frequency. And we would have said you'd expect much less B2B in terms of every transaction than B2C. But that gets turned upside down when you move into an Internet of Things world and start facilitating machine to machine connections, which could, well, the numbers can be staggering. So leave it at that. Next slide. So, what I want to share with you are the results of some research, but I want to go back to some work that Marshall and I have done that really spans not 2018, but goes back into just after the millennium. Uh, and what I want to focus on is when you think about a platform, well, where does the value actually come from? We think of network effects as being dominant, and of course, they're very interesting and they determine strategy and market outcomes. But honestly, there's still an awful lot of value that gets delivered from the platform or from the core service itself. And so we think of this kind of same side network effect that arises from collaboration, a cross side network effect that comes from the creation of markets and ecosystems, and then some standalone service. And a easy example would be, say, the spreadsheet system Excel. Lots of standalone value. You can do all kinds of things with it. Lots of collaboration value. You can share financial information and working documents. A little bit of cross-side, but honestly, the core functionality is sufficient for most users. Next slide. So the way that we wanted to think about that framework is to look into some business to business platforms. And so BDI is a business sort of sponsored group in Germany, and they pulled 79 platforms and then did some categorization on them. So this was a report that was issued last year. It gave us a nice kind of seed that we could dig in and have a look. And just, you're not supposed to read the things on the right, but so you have Railagent and Bevazar. Those are systems that are in that data set. At a high level, they ended up categorizing them as data centric or transaction centric. And that's a really good first cut. But for us, it left us asking some questions around the management, the investment, how you stage those systems and then run them. And so what we did, click one more, please, is we took that database and then we had two independent experts code and read through the descriptions and then make judgments as to whether the primary value proposition was a standalone, a same-side network effect, or a cross-side network effect. And happily, we were able to, in effect, generate many of the same categories. So for example, marketplaces, networking, which actually split into a couple different types, supply chain management. So you might ask, if the goal here was simply to replicate what was done, what was the point? I think the point is we're being much more precise about where the value comes from. And so often at launch, you have to provide an independent value proposition so that you can get users on board. But that doesn't work for marketplaces. Marketplaces simply have to have a supply side and a demand side so that you can realize transactions. So next slide. So that ends up dovetailing into a project that I've been working on for the last couple of years. And so this is with the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Advanced Manufacturing and Production. And so the kind of charge for this group has been to understand, in effect, cutting edge technologies and how those might roll out to do a number of things. And those would be to improve quality, sort of reduce cost. Those are kind of standard. But also, and I think increasingly important, is to do a better job at measuring and then reducing things like greenhouse gases. So that's been a fairly broad mandate. What we ended up doing was working with about 50 companies and then looking at their examples of implementing some kind of digital transformation advanced manufacturing system. Uh, and you'd say, well, what does that have to do with platforms? And I'll show you. Next slide. So when we worked through the first round of the data, we were in the middle of the pandemic. So we issued this report a year ago. And uh, what we ended up finding that was most interesting was firms that had done an end-to-end digital infrastructure investment were much more nimble in their pivoting to deal with disrupted supply and disrupted demand. And they were able to kind of see all the way through both the supply chain and even down to the factory floor, which then gave them the optionality to then respond to some of the pandemic driven disruption. So that was like our starting point last year. Next slide, please. And so over the past year, I think you might have just clicked that link, which should be interesting. Maybe. Yeah. Okay. So over the past year, what we've done is take the examples of the firms in that council, and again, about 50, and then look at their technology initiatives, and then really try to categorize them. And so where we ended up landing was you had a lot of relatively straightforward, we'll call it point solutions, an experiment and application. And those have a reasonable value proposition. You can measure their impact and then decide if it's something you want to roll out to a number of different facilities, potentially up and down your supply chain. Those first two categories were really the bulk, I'd say, of what we saw in our database. But then we also saw a number of interesting kind of infrastructure plays. And those infrastructure plays might be things like creating and stacking solutions from different organizations, or trying to build more open architectures that would allow for different organizations to plug in. And then the point of that is to then lay in the infrastructure that allows you to do some kind of a business model transformation and then run a marketplace. Or if you have technology that that your kind of ecosystem partners can connect to, then you might even end up running both a marketplace and an ecosystem platform. And so that's the connection between, this world of kind of atoms that we're kind of rolling up our sleeves and thinking, well, we're making stuff, but it ends up being a digital world all the same, but not without some challenges. Next slide, please. And you can click once more, please. And so what's interesting here is there's a lot of work at the organizational level to make these infrastructure investments, to make these technology investments go. And so we're literally in the middle of doing deep dive interviews, really across a lot of different industries, for the metrics that organizations are using to understand and stage gate their technology investments. And again, the first two aren't too bad. If you've got a reasonable value proposition, it's a point solution, great. You can hang a return on investment, which is essentially a point estimate of some sort of a distribution of the benefits. Where that ends up failing is in these infrastructure investments where you're really laying the groundwork for some sort of either market or platform on the right-hand side, or essentially point solutions at scale on the left-hand side. And so the ROI metrics end up failing. And from sort of organization to organization, you end up with this frustration in the sort of voices of the business unit leaders that are trying to get these projects through the various investment review committees. And we've even heard some organizations say, we just buried those infrastructure investments into our ongoing maintenance, recurring costs. Not the right way to do it, because these are actually strategic investments. So you end up with some cases people routing around. We'd point out that you're much more likely to want to adopt some kind of an options framework, because that's what you're creating here is a whole set of options. And then once you go into marketplaces, now you've got a whole new set of metrics. Those are things around the health of the ecosystem, the growth in the user base, the rates of innovation that are created not just internal to a firm, but external with your partners. And so that's another kind of set of organizational muscles that need to be built out, that look not only internally, but also externally. And that's what we're finding, and just across a whole set of industries, from financial services to healthcare, and now with this deep dive into the manufacturing sector. So next slide. And so our takeaways, and I'd say that this is research in progress. We've had a great sponsor over the past 2 years with BASF. Now going forward, we're going to continue that work with additional sponsors, and to just dive into the ways that B2B platforms differ from B2C, and then looking at the fundamental economics of where value creation comes from. And then finally, you've got this, I'll just sort of zoom to the end, this sort of worse before better, which those of you who have looked at kind of these J curves will recall. You get a little bit of a positive benefit, and then you go through this kind of trough of negative returns, if you will, and then hoping that you leverage for a future. So with that, it's my great pleasure to hand it over to Pinar Ozkan.
All right. Hope everyone can hear me. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you, everyone, organizers, my fellow panelists, for including me. What I'd love to talk to you about is the way that platforms are coming into regulated industries, and this is based on some of the research that we're doing at the Oxford Future of Finance and Technology, or FinTech initiative. So I'll be talking to you a little bit about platforms coming into finance, and then making parallels to how they're also coming into healthcare. And next slide, please. So my fellow panelists and their revolutionary book in 2016 have included a section towards the end where they discuss how most of the regulated markets have been spared from platform invasion, and they give some very important reasons for these, such as regulators favoring incumbents, the economics of the industry not being worth it, and the barriers to entry being too high for platform startups. And they also go through the different regulated markets, and then discuss some of the industry dynamics in each of them. So taking that as a base, what we've done is we've looked at how some of these markets are changing recently. And if we can go on, slide forward, please. And what we're seeing is that there's actually quite a bit of disruption, but this is quite recent. It's happening in the last few years. Google has announced that within this year, they're going to be starting to offer banking services in the US. And Amazon has recently purchased PillPack in order to get into the pharmacy side of healthcare. And Google is obviously come in more and more into students' lives together with the acceleration of the pandemic. Next slide, please. One of the things that's quite interesting to look at is how platforms might change industry dynamics in different industries. And my example to you will be finance. The first question that's always interesting to ask when it comes to platforms is where does data reside in an industry? Because whether platforms can get access to that data or not is a very important question, since their business model is largely driven by data analysis. And in finance, until very recently, data resided in large financial institutions. So you access your financial data by looking at either a proprietary bank mobile app or the internet. However, you couldn't really download that data in a way that you could work on it yourself, or you couldn't share it. And that was supposed to be for the safety of this data, as data is sensitive in finance and in some other industries. Moving forward, please. However, then the question becomes, if you can see data whenever you like, but you can't really do anything with it, and most importantly, if you cannot share with it, it doesn't travel, then who does the data belong to? And this was the starting point of some regulatory change, where regulators realized that, as well as in other industries, in finance, competition is going to be based on data. Data is going to be the new weapon, and therefore data sharing regulations need to be changed in finance. Forward, please. This is how open banking and related regulations came in. And these regulations are a way for customers to share their data in a secure way through open APIs. And as you can see on the left, in the old world, you and I can only access our bank data, financial data, through proprietary apps of our financial institutions. Whereas in the new world, on the right, you can still use the proprietary apps, but you can also electronically give consent to third parties to reach your data in order to for them to analyze it and give you competing services. And so what the regulators are doing is they're putting data sharing as the core of competition in the future of banking. Forward, please. What this has led to, along, of course, with some other factors, is that as soon as fintechs realized that they could now get access to data, they started to offer services by looking at different pieces of data. Although open banking only gives access to transactional data, meaning payment data, the money coming in and going out of your account, there's already so much you can do with just that data. And so single service fintechs have started to attack big banks. What you see in that picture, in the smaller square rectangle in the middle, is an HSBC website. And all around it are different fintechs that are attacking that bank or any other traditional bank with single service offerings. And in a sense, this is causing an unbundling of services. Forward, please. However, what we're seeing is that these single service fintechs, although some of them are quite well known, in general, in a data sensitive industry where customer trust is difficult to establish, and the liability of newness for an entrepreneurial firm is actually quite high, these single service fintechs are obviously not all doing very well, and most of them are struggling. And perhaps they're struggling a bit more compared to the startups in other industries, just due to the sensitivity of the data and the regulatory landscape, which makes it very expensive to operate. This is where sectoral platforms are coming into finance. All those single fintechs that find it difficult to make it on their own, both in terms of raising customer awareness and earning customers' trust, are able to get onboarded onto digital banks that offer only a few very basic services, like a checking account and maybe a savings account at the best. But then they onboard fintechs in order to create a digital platform that is just for finance. So this is the first type of platform that we see in finance, where in a sense, services that were unbundled from the banks are being rebundled around digital players that are still mostly within finance. Moving forward. Another interesting comparison, this is based on a research that we did with the Swift Institute, which is coming out this month. What we looked at are different types of entrants into finance and obviously the incumbents. And what we've seen is that the fintechs, which are on the left in the upper box, they have lots of advantages, such as they have cheaper, more user-friendly services because they're digital born, they're quite nimble. And on the other hand, they, as I said before, they have difficulty earning customers' trust. Therefore, because they don't have many resources, their systems are not resilient, and international growth is difficult because lots of different financial services are very much dependent on local regulations. So it's a mixed bag. On the other hand, a traditional bank has very different advantages and disadvantages. They're a trusted brand. Most of us trust our bank for keeping our money safe. And the resources that they have are immense in terms of kind of working on both compliance and technology. However, at the same time, because they've existed for so long and they've merged and acquired with other banks, their IT is actually IT infrastructure is in silos, their data is disparate, and this makes it difficult for them to think of that data in a holistic way. And obviously their organizational structure and culture are also in silos. So when you compare these two, you realize that none of the players are really kind of at a complete advantage. They have advantages and disadvantages in competition. However, moving forward, please. When we think about, oh, that color didn't come out as I intended, but hopefully you can read. When we think about a third type of player, it's not just entrepreneurial entrants that open banking invites into the world of finance and banking in particular, but also big tech. Because big tech has the trusted brand. And although there's interesting research showing that if you ask in abstract, most consumers say that they don't trust Facebook, they don't necessarily trust Google, but still in our lives, we use them on a daily basis. They have the resources to invest into this industry, and they're digital born. So a platform, a business model is not foreign to them. And of course, there are all those single service fintechs that we just mentioned that are struggling on their own are perfect complementers to get onboarded into these platforms. Moving forward. And thus we see lots of interesting entry by big tech as well into finance, which constitutes the second type of platform that we see in finance. For example, Amazon, with its strong retail platform, has started to offer lending services to the small to medium businesses on its platform, which is a very natural step for them to strengthen their platform. Google, on the other hand, has a very much a kind of data capture and analysis strategy. And therefore, although basic banking services are not profitable, it's a great way for Google to increase its database and use it in a cross-sector synergistic way. And Facebook is interesting because in the Western world, we may be cooling off of Facebook, but what's interesting to think about in the context of Facebook is that there are more Facebook and Instagram subscribers in the world than there are people with bank accounts. And Facebook naturally is then investing into peer-to-peer payments and microfinance and really kind of being the, in a sense, financial provider of those populations in the developing world, in rural parts of the world that don't have a bank account, but because cell phones are so cheap now, they have a smartphone that they can do financial services with. And so, as you can see, different big tech players are entering finance from different angles based on what they have built so far. And so what we see is that there's going to be an interesting battle, not just between big tech in terms of grabbing different financial services and onboarding them onto their platform, serving the platform, therefore, as a bank, but also between big tech and the digital banks that are coming in order to rebundle some of those financial services. Moving forward. So overall, with COVID, what we're seeing is that obviously more data is being generated because a lot of what we do has now shifted to online. This summit is an example of that. And what we also see is that industries are being digitally colonized by platforms. And I'll explain in the next slide what that means in the example of healthcare, and that will be my last slide. Moving forward, please. So we've recently looked into the healthcare sector, and this is a paper that's coming out in a few months in the California Management Review, where we have considered where big tech enters the healthcare sector, looking into the UK and US where they're most active. And what we're seeing is that healthcare, they come in typically as healthcare IT providers in order to get access to data. So they have no business of trying to become your primary healthcare provider, but they want to be the IT providers of healthcare. And moving forward, once they have that data, this is what happens. Using that data, they start to attack the ecosystem from different places. So for example, Google is famous for investing into biotech. Both Google and Microsoft are also investing into healthcare device manufacturers using the healthcare data that they have. Microsoft has an advantage in that Microsoft has been the IT provider of healthcare providers like NHS and hospitals all over the world. And so this makes a difference because they already have the corporate relationships and they already have access to the data. And so overall, what we see is that the primary service providers in healthcare are not changing. However, the power is shifting to big tech because they are the ones that keep the data, and they are the ones that use the data in order to give the very valuable prediction services that will help healthcare providers save lots of money because they can avoid treatments through preventative care, and also obviously moving forward in general and saving lives overall. So this is what's happening in healthcare, which is not too far from what's happening in finance. And that, I believe, is my last slide, and I'm very happy to turn it over to Marshall.
Fantastic. Let me make sure everyone can hear me. Peter, thanks for advancing the slides. Let me start with pointing out what Pinar has done with introduction is fantastic, because I want to pick up on regulation, especially these ideas of open APIs and data regulation as key. We're going to do a couple of things in this. So I want to give you three things for today. All right, so we've got a couple of things for the conference, but one of them is going to be just kind of a forecast on the regulation. And we want to introduce a new data right. We've actually proposed a new kind of data right. So you can say you heard that here first at the MIT Summit. That we think actually is going to be adopted. It's quite similar to the kinds of things that Pinar just introduced. The second is, why would you do these open systems? What are the benefits of opening the APIs? We'll give you some actual data behind that. And third, we'll give you some new research on, well, how would you go about valuing these things? Well, how would you value network effects on these platforms? If we're interested in breaking them up, or if we're interested in the regulation, how does that work? So we'll start with the regulation overview. So here you can see is an Amazon umpire calling balls and strikes and fouls on an Amazon player, wiping out the competition. So is it fair for this to be happening? This is exactly one of the things that's going on in the regulatory environment today. There's a huge amount of interest in the regulatory horizon. If we go to the next slide, we can actually even see what's been happening in the new Biden administration. They've adopted a framework which you might even call, hipster antitrust. It's been colloquially named, or it's a new Brandeis approach to economics of antitrust, which is the time introduced at Standard Oil. One of the arguments made by these individuals, so Lina Khan is someone who has a very famous article out of Yale on the antitrust paradox of Amazon itself. Tim Wu is also a law professor at Columbia. Lina has now been elevated to FTC chair. So this is serious. Regulation is coming, and we should absolutely anticipate more changes coming down the horizon. The challenge they issue to traditional antitrust is a consumer welfare standard based narrowly on prices. If price is the index of consumer value, what does that mean in a market where the price is typically zero? Does that also omit harms to innovation? Does that omit harms to competition? Policy is a little bit schizophrenic here. One thing I need to highlight is some wonderful observations by, I think it's Benedict Evans and others. Consider, a lot of the times the policies are, let's remove friction. We want to get interoperability. We want everyone to have access to the data. Then the flip side, we get policies that are, we got to add friction to give privacy. Those are conflicting goals. We really have to figure out what's happening. The other element here is we have to think of not just of the prices themselves, we also have to think about how value is created and how you design network effects. We'll actually give you some more ways to do that in just a moment. So Peter, if you advance to the next slide, here is a list of some of the legislation that's been introduced only in the current term. So we have in the introduction of the Access Act, the Innovation and Choice Act, Ending Platform Monopolies Act, Filing Fee Modernization and Platform Competition. These are intended to do a number of different things. So one of these is to prevent platforms from competing in their own markets. Another might be ending discrimination. So can they self-preference or not? Another one might be whether they can acquire firms in adjacent markets or not, or should they be broken up or should they be divided? So Peter, if you go to the next slide, I'd like to summarize a couple of the good ideas and some of the bad ideas and give you a little bit of highlights of why this might be a case and see if we can then design a few things that might even be helpful. I want to highlight some of the most interesting and innovative legislation that's coming out of the European Union. It's exactly the kind of thing that Pinar just introduced. As a side note, by the way, if you had questions on this or for Pinar or other, please do post them in Slido so we can actually get to those at the end. But some of the bad ideas in current legislation. So one of these is simply breaking them up. The problem of this is it doesn't actually address the mechanism by which these firms operate, which is these network effects, users creating value for other users. That would just create mini monopolies, which would then affect growth. So it's not actually addressing the key issue, and in fact, it would divide up value. Another is a strict prohibition on use of merged data. We can actually see consequences of that in some of the HIPAA requirements that are so strict, it's really hard to gain access to data or to develop new cures or alternates. Imagine you can't do contact tracing in an environment of that source. You can't create that additional value. You want to do it, but do so in a way that respects user permissions or give them the data rights. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Another is moving into adjacent markets. My suspicion is, to use an example, at least in the United States case, it might be a good thing if Amazon moves into healthcare and does bring prices down. The margins there are absurd, and we have the highest cost in the world, and we want to invite competition. It's fascinating that prohibitions on selling one's own market, a lot of these prescriptions are well-intended and they do identify legitimate problems, but the solution actually introduces a new harm, which in this case, it prevents a new efficiency. In almost any market, in any other context, we want entry of really good firms because that creates consumer value. In this case, however, there's privileged or differential access of the platform firm itself because of the data that it has on its competitors. So this is where we need to address some of the concerns. So we need to allow the entry, but we also need to allow access. So the ideas here. Well, one of them, of course, is to prevent the self-preference. We can't have Amazon calling foul on its own plays relative to other players. So that's absolutely a fantastic idea. We do need to work with that. Another one is interoperability. To the extent that others can gain access to the data, this is the right approach. We're going to come back to this again in a moment on infrastructure. Another proposal, this one also coming out of Europe, but lots in the United States, we see this even in California, is data portability. The premise is you create competition by allowing others to take their data and move it to other locations. We want to introduce a new data right, which we think is even better than that. I'll show you why in just a moment. The other interesting element is to introduce competing governance models on top of the infrastructure rather than breaking up the infrastructure. Or actually breaking up the firms in this case. So I think this would actually create more value. So Peter, let's go to the next point, the next slide, and take a look at what's the proposal here in terms of infrastructure. Many of you might have even noticed in this weekend's New York Times, the Ohio Attorney General just sued to convert Google into infrastructure. The argument is you want to give equal access to it. He wants to treat it like highways and like railroads. There's an element of this which is good. There's an element of this which is bad. The good element of it is equal access for everybody. You can't discriminate. He uses the story of Vanderbilt that controlled a key bridge into New York. And the use of that bridge, every competitor in the rail industry. Their stock plummeted, he then bought all of their stock and then opened it and made himself an even stronger monopoly. That is how we got the Sherman Antitrust Act. So that extent is good. We want to create equal equivalence of access. The problem that we have is that treating it as infrastructure also misses key elements of the internet economy or platforms. The traditional goods are based on rival manufacture, or railroads or highways are physical goods with contested access. Not so for data. You can share data and you can create additional wealth by giving multiple parties access. So we need to go beyond just equivalence of access to shared access to some of the key resources. And again, this gets contentious on who owns the data rights. So we need to see if we can actually do a better design. So let's move to the area of design. Here, let's go to data portability. So the theory of data portability is moving around, but data portability has several problems. One, it was a great experiment done by the folks at Programmable Web, where they tried to download the data from Facebook. It didn't work. Why? Even though it was consistent with data portability, it loses context. Your friends' posts are their data, so you don't get it. So downloading your own removes the context and it loses a lot of that value. Second, data transfers are a depreciating stock of capital. You want flows of information, not a one-time element of it. So you need to solve the depreciation problem. Third, data removed from context is not actionable. You can't share with friends, you can't make purchases, you can't receive benefits from third parties. And there's one that's grossly underappreciated. The argument is you want to reduce the monopoly power of Amazon by allowing merchants to take their data off the site so they could shop up someplace else. But here's the problem. They take and they drop all of their 1- and 2-star reviews, and they only present their 4- and 5-star reviews. That's more, it actually increases the risk of, because you don't have a complete purchase. It's as if each and every one of us could then modify our own credit reports. That's not healthy. So Peter, if you go to the next slide, we're proposing a new data right. We're calling it an in situ data right. The difference here is rather than taking the data out of the system, the idea is rather instead to bring the algorithm to the data. The in situ data right is basically to use, users would gain the right to use the data where it is located. Huge number of benefits. One of these is all context is preserved. So you do have all the data for friends and third parties. Second, it grants access to all the recent flows. So it's current, it's not stale. Third, really powerful. If you think someone is misusing your data, you cut off their access. You turn off the APIs and you know they no longer have access. You don't have to trust that they're actually going to delete your data. Fourth, the in situ data is actionable. The critical structure, you can make purchases, you can receive benefits based on your data. And lastly, full information is preserved, which actually solves the moral hazard problem and makes risk assessment more accurate. I'm happy to say, and again, this is where one of the benefits of coming to the MIT conference is. This is work done with Jeff and also Georgos Petropoulos. We were involved in the review of the European Digital Markets Act. Upon consideration of this proposal, the Europeans appear to be adopting this in the next generation of the Digital Markets Act. So not only did you hear it here, but you may be able to design these own data rights in your own firms in order that you can actually have some of these values, or as on users, you could request these in situ data rights. Let me give you another reason why you should do this. Okay, so Peter, let's go to the next slide. And actually, you can go ahead with the first animation as well. This is a map of all of the open APIs on the programmable web. You can actually see small boxes circling just Fitbit, you know, I happen to have one, or Dropbox or Coinbase as other examples in there. It's absolutely fascinating. This is a mashup of the APIs that other firms are using. This is all public, okay? What's fascinating is that the index of centrality or betweenness is correlated with your market cap. So notice, for example, Coinbase has a very high market capitalization. It's used the APIs, and one of the reasons is third parties are building on top. Opening APIs allows third parties to build on top. So these are some really wonderful examples of creating value out of your own organization. You can actually see, it's interesting also, it's not just the big names necessarily. You might have a couple of unexpected cases. Number 2 in this list is actually Verizon in here. So you can actually see a number of different organizations are doing. Peter, if you'll jump to the next slide, we'll show these are the economic benefits of doing this. So we looked at about 240 different firms, and these data are pre-pandemic, but we looked at their market cap, their productivity, their cost structure. We looked at the B2C APIs, the B2B APIs, and the internal APIs. Notice the revenue gains that you get from B2B APIs. They're enormous. You also get a cost savings. You see the costs reduced as you use the APIs. And you also see a large net income. So there's a huge advantage of using these APIs. So Peter, if you advance one more slide, one more click, we do, no, go back one. We do have to be a little bit cautious on this because it's not all complete gains. And again, you get a 4% gain on market cap. And the average firm in our sample was 2.3 billion, which gives you 86 million in capital gains. That's enormous. The downside is you must manage the risk. Some of the you do experience when you open APIs a 13.5% increase in hacking risk. We actually also merged the database of all data breaches. And so we do find, in fact, there is an increase in data breaches. We also find a differential sample. Those really good firms are paying attention and detect it immediately and turn off the APIs quickly. The bad firms aren't paying attention and they actually run that down. So let's go to the next.
We're at the top of the hour, Marshall.
Okay. Let me give one thought and then we'll turn it over. So if you just go to the last slide, and you can just animate. We'll give you the one idea from the last slide. A lot of the questions that we have. Go back one. A lot of the questions we have for these firms is how do you value them, free customers or others. The idea is it's not just advertising for the individual customer. You have to look at the value they create for others. We developed a model of customer lifetime value in network markets that you can actually use to value the customers by how much value they create for others. So that value is all available. And I want to say, these are the kinds of things we hope to be able to give you as benefit for having come to the MIT Summit. Here, if you're interested in these things, here's the papers on in situ data rights. Here are the papers on APIs and market cap. And here are the papers on these new methods for valuing customer lifetime, and even valuing firms using these network marketplaces. So these are all things that we hope that you can actually get as a result of the summit. So with that, thank you. I don't know if we're going to handle a question or not, or if I think we're going to wrap that.
We're going to wrap right up.
We're going to wrap it. Okay, wonderful. We'll turn it over
very much,
to
everybody. We're going to turn it over to our next discussion. It's going to be a fireside chat.